Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. My name is Rudyard Griffiths. I'm the moderator of the Munk Debates. We're here for our pre-debate interviews with our two presenters tonight. You're watching this on Facebook Live right now. It's my pleasure to bring into this conversation Niall Ferguson, a renowned historian, filmmaker, and commentator. Niall, great to have you in Toronto for these debates. This is the second time only in this series that we're going to have a one-on-one matchup, you versus Fareed Zakaria. I want to start with just some first principles for you. Define liberal international order, because there's various ways to look at that phrase and what it means. Unpack it for us.
Well, it sounds like motherhood and apple pie, doesn't it, when you first hear those words? Because who's against liberalism and who's against international things? And, well, order, isn't that a desirable thing too? But when you put them together, you, I think, have a potted theory of history. And the theory of history says, well, the reason that the world is so awesome is that we had a liberal international order after 1945, a whole bunch of international institutions, including the United Nations and the European Union and the World Trade Organization, and they created this lovely global economy in which there was free movement of goods and of people and of capital, and the world has been much more peaceful and prosperous ever since. And I'm going to argue tonight that that is nonsense, and in fact it's fake history, which is even worse than fake news.
Now let's talk a bit about your critique of the liberal international order, because in addition to seeing a series of external threats, you have a conviction that part of the crisis of the liberal international order is self-inflicted. It's internal. It has to do with the electorates and what's happened to them within the Western democracies of the world.
Well, I think if one looks at what globalization has done, and let's assume that liberal international order is just another way of talking about globalization, it's been enormously beneficial to, well, people like me and Fareed Zakaria, and you too, Rudyard. I mean, it's been terrific for the 1% of people who have benefited from the global integration of markets for goods and markets for capital, and from migration. I'm an immigrant, and so is Fareed. So it's not really surprising that we think the liberal international order is awesome, because it's been awesome for us. The problem is, and we've seen this in the past before, if you go too far in allowing flows of goods and people and capital across borders, not everybody benefits. In fact, a substantial chunk of the population in developed countries has not benefited from what I'll call hyperglobalization. I mean, I think the experiment was going pretty well in the 80s and 90s, but we overshot. And this overshooting in terms of immigration, capital flows, and trade has produced pretty negative results for a lot of people at the lower end of the income distribution. Remember, most of the benefits of this liberal international order went to the top 20% of the income distribution in Canada, in the United States, in most European countries, and a really big chunk of that went to the top 1%. If you were at the lower end of the income distribution, didn't go to college, relatively unskilled, in fact, the last 20 years have been pretty poor for you, and you're probably worse off than you were back in 1999. And if you're trying to explain why populists have started to attack the liberal international order and use terms like globalist as insults, then I think that's why, because a lot of people have lost out. And it's not only Donald Trump, it's a whole range of candidates for elected office around the world who've started to say, we've had too much globalization. We need to dial it back, restrict immigration. We need to renegotiate trade agreements. And I think the most powerful critique actually has been of a liberal international order for finance, because taking down all constraints on international capital flows led ultimately to a succession of financial crises, of which the most spectacular was in 2008. That really hurt a lot of people, and that, I think, is why the populist backlash finally came after the financial crisis. I remember being interviewed in this city in 2009 by the Globe and Mail, and they asked me what I thought the consequences of the financial crisis would be. It had just begun. And the headline that they came up with, which was a quote from me, was, "There will be blood," by which I meant there will be a political backlash. Well, it has come, and I think in that sense, we can no longer confidently talk about a liberal international order. It's become disorder in the sense that democracy has been disrupted. And there are parts of the world which are anything but orderly at the moment, again as a consequence of excessive globalization.
Let me try out a few of the counter arguments, positions no doubt that you may confront on this stage tonight. And I think the first would be that this order has just been too successful, not necessarily in its own right, but in comparison to the next best alternative. And that if you look at the regimes of China and Russia, some of the traditional competitors to the liberal international order that are put out there, fundamentally, those are just highly unattractive ways for finance to organize itself, for people to organize itself, for societies to organize itself. So why isn't the success of the liberal international order just inevitable based on the next best alternative not really being that great?
Well, it's funny you should say that, Rudyard, because as far as I can see, the principal beneficiary of the liberal international order has been the People's Republic of China and the Communist Party that runs it. I don't go to Davos anymore because I've had about enough of that, but Fareed goes each year, and I'm sure in January when he was at Davos, he heard none other than Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, defend the international liberal order. It was fascinating to hear the arguments for free trade and free capital movement coming from a Chinese communist. That gives you a clue as to what is wrong with the liberal international order. Its principal beneficiary, certainly since the 1980s, has been a one-party state that is anything but liberal politically. China has been the main beneficiary of this order. Not Canada, not the United States, not Europe. China has been the winner. And that seems to me to make the whole idea of a liberal international order rather suspect. How can it ultimately be a liberal order if its principal beneficiary is the People's Republic of China, a one-party state?
Let's talk about hard power, because as a historian, it's something you've written and thought a lot about. If you look at the distribution of hard power in the world, 55% of global defense spending originates in one country, the United States. Again, why isn't that an indication that the existing order will persevere? Because, again, the competitors to that order, in terms of the hard power that they can project against it, are Lilliputian.
Well, we have to be a little bit careful with our terms here, because if I'm not careful, everything is going to be attributed to the liberal international order, including the US defense budget. Look, if the world has been relatively more peaceful since 1945 than it was in the first half of the 20th century, which it certainly has been, the main reason is not because the United Nations was created, much less the European Union. The main reason is that the United States decided to engage, as it had not in the 1920s and 1930s, and play a leadership role. Now, if you think that the US defense budget is an aspect of the liberal international order, then words have lost all their meaning, because the US defense budget has been maintained at a high level, mainly because of conservative politicians, not because of liberal ones. It's international in the sense that the United States imposes the Pax Americana through a system of alliances and military deployments. And it's an order, yes, it is an order, but an order that depends on a nation state, the strongest nation state, the United States. Now, it seems to me we have to draw a distinction here if words are to have meaning. We cannot attribute the stability or relative stability of the world in the second half of the 20th century and the first quarter of the 21st century to a liberal international order if the real cause is a nation state, the United States, which has become strong mainly because conservative politicians insisted that the defense budget be maintained at a relatively very high level. There is order of a sort, but it seems to me that if one takes a step back, one of the striking features of certainly this century has been the crumbling of the Pax Americana, its loss of legitimacy, its loss of effectiveness, most obviously in Iraq, not to mention Afghanistan. So even the order itself seems to me to be crumbling before our very eyes. I think the Pax Americana was the big story after 1945. I think the big story since 9/11 has been its crumbling.
Just one last argument to try out at you. The idea of closed versus open systems and orders. That I guess proponents of the liberal international order say part of its strength is that it is an open system, that it's based on a network, and it's based on expanding that network globally, which it's done arguably quite well over the last number of decades. Its competitors and its alternatives very much look like closed systems, most notably China, an autocratic state. So in history, Are there examples of open systems losing out to closed systems? And why aren't people right to think that possibly the open system always wins?
I think you're maybe going to confuse listeners if you think the distinction is between a liberal international order and China or some other authoritarian regime, because in fact the liberal international order has been very beneficial to closed societies, politically closed societies like China. And indeed, the main beneficiaries of globalization since the 1980s have been states like China that have embraced the rules of the road when it comes to trade and to some extent also to capital movements, but have not made any concessions on the issue of democracy. This is the paradox of our time. Yes, there was a liberal international order in the sense that we created institutions like the World Trade Organization and the International Monetary Fund, and we created rules for the global economy. And then we said that the Chinese, if they wanted to, could come play. And we bent those rules quite significantly so that the Chinese could join the WTO and their currency could become part of the IMF special drawing right. And they've taken full advantage of the system that was created. It hasn't made them any more liberal. In fact, it's re-legitimized their system of one-party state rule without the rule of law. And that's the central weakness of this entire project. We told ourselves, remember Bill Clinton making this argument that if we only had a system of free trade, then the authoritarians of the world would politically transition to our wonderful democratic system. This was Frank Fukuyama's vision in The End of History. Well, guess what? It didn't work out that way. Actually, what has happened is that illiberal pseudo-democracies and full-blown authoritarian regimes like China's have done very well on the back of globalization. They've greatly increased their share of GDP. You know, China's share of GDP is now larger than that of the United States and Canada combined on a purchasing power parity basis if you do the numbers now. And that trend is only going to continue. So they've been the winners of this wonderful liberal international order, which makes me wonder if it's a bit like what Voltaire said the Holy Roman Empire was like. Voltaire said that the thing about the Holy Roman Empire is that it's neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. Well, the thing about the liberal international order is it's neither liberal, nor very international, nor very orderly.
Interesting point. I want to end on just your thoughts as to what you might look for next in terms of symptoms or signs that the liberal order really is under acute pressure and stress and maybe heading towards some kind of end. I mean, we've talked about Brexit. We've talked about Trump as symptoms of the decline of the liberal international order, but what would you look for next to herald some more significant change?
Well, the naive view is to say, oh, well, populists are going to win all elections forevermore, and then to say when they don't, there you are, this was all overhyped. I mean, I think the populist backlash that we saw in the English-speaking world last year is only a part of the story. I think we saw already in 2008 a financial crisis that revealed the fragility of the international financial system. I think it's still very fragile, and I wouldn't be surprised if we saw another financial crisis in the relatively near future, quite possibly emanating from China. Then you have to ask yourself, is this wonderful system capable of delivering order to the most disorderly part of the world, which is North Africa and the Middle East? Well, there's not much sign of it at this point. And my fear is that things are going to get worse before they get better, not only in Syria and Iraq, but further afield, where actually we have a problem of escalating conflict and state failure. So if one's looking for signs of future crisis, don't just look at politics, don't just look at populism. That's only one of the symptoms that this liberal international order is in trouble. I think look for the next financial crisis and then look for the next conflict. The big lesson of history, Rudyard, and this is a point I want to make tonight, is that we've run the experiment of hyper-globalization before. In the late 19th century, there were almost no restrictions on migration, on trade, and capital flowed across borders with almost no regulation. This was a very globalized world, and at the time, the 1% who benefited from it were tremendously happy, and people wrote books, a bit like Farid does, saying, in this wonderful new order, there'll never be another war because everything is awesome. Unfortunately, the populist backlash was just the beginning of a succession of crises that ultimately culminated in 1914 with the First World War. war can be global too, and we'll know that the liberal international order has truly failed when it does what the last iteration did in the early 20th century, and that is to produce a major conflict.
Sobering words, Neil. We're going to hear a lot more tonight. Well, thank you for coming to Toronto. You've got a debate to prepare for us. I'm going to let you go do that. But again, great to have your input and analysis.
Thanks, Roger.
I've been talking with Niall Ferguson, who's going to be one of our two debaters tonight. The resolution before the House, be it resolved, the liberal international order is over. If you're watching this right now on Facebook Live, stay tuned. In a matter of moments, we'll have Zakaria here in conversation with me to get his argument, his take on why the liberal international order isn't over. That interview coming to you in a matter of moments. Stay tuned. Thanks. Hello and welcome back to our pre-debate interviews. I'm Rudyard Griffiths, the moderator of the Munk debates, and as we do before each debate, we have these exclusive interviews available to you, Facebook Live viewers, talking to, in this case, Zakaria, who will be arguing tonight against the motion, be it resolved, the liberal international order is over. We all know Zakaria is the host of top-rated CNN show, GPS, and a best-selling author, and generally a much sought-after voice on geopolitics and international affairs. Fareed, great to have you here in Toronto for another Munk debate. This is our 20th, and it's only the second time in this series that we're going to have a one-on-one debate. So I'm really excited to see how this happens. I think it's going to allow the debate to breathe a bit between you and Neil. And in that regard, I thought it could be helpful for audiences preparing for tonight's debate to have you define what the liberal international order is, because there's a variety of ways to understand it historically, how it's evolved, and what it constitutes today.
Thanks, first of all, Rudy. It's always a pleasure. The Munk debates are, frankly, one of the most extraordinary intellectual events, I think, that has been created in these last few decades, and a lot of that credit goes to you. I think of the liberal international order very simply. It's the world we live in. It's the world that we have come to take for granted, but that is actually very, very unusual. If you think about it, for most of human history, the world has been characterized by constant power struggles, wars, economic crises. Relations between countries have been largely conflictual, predatory, mercantilist. And that's been the world, as I say, for most of human history. And then after World War II, the major countries of the world, led by the United States, decided we're going to try something different. We're going to try to create a more stable world, a world that has some modicum of order, where there is openness in terms of economics, in terms of trade, where we encourage openness in politics so that democracy becomes one of the aspirational qualities of this kind of order, and where human rights are observed more routinely than they have been through a series of conventions and laws and things like that. Now, it's important to point out, of course this is not a perfect world. Of course there have been wars. Of course there have been huge human rights violations. But what's actually striking is the degree to which that vision that people like Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman and Mackenzie King had has actually borne out. So the rates of violence as measured by most people are dramatically down over the last 30 or 40 years and over the last 50 or 60 years. Great power competition of the kind that was normal has gone away. You've created an open world economy where trade, capital flows, and growth have gone up and up and up and up, pulling all kinds of countries out of poverty, from Latin America to China. And you have had a greater observance of human rights, particularly among the major civilized powers of the world. Now you may say, oh, but that was normal, that's ordinary. No, actually it was not. Germany, to put it very simply, was not actually a country that observed human rights norms for the first half of the 20th century. For the second half of the 20th century, it became an exemplary country. The same is true of countries like France and Britain in their colonial empires. So there's been this transformation that is so dramatic. But in some ways, we live with it now. It's like the air we breathe, so we don't notice it. But like air, you take it away, and we'd be living in a very different world.
Mm-hmm. The stresses, though, on that order, people point to Brexit. They point to the election of Trump. They point to the rise of populism as not a new, but a resurgent political phenomenon through much of the Western world. What are these? Are these irritants in the liberal international order, or are they graver threats to its existence?
Look, they're all threats. Nothing works automatically. This liberal international order has its problems, it has its stresses, it has its strains, and there are challenges to it. And so it's always a work in progress. It's always going to require that there be fixes, adjustment, changes. I would put these in two categories. The first are challenges like Brexit, Trump, and those are challenges born out of the reality that there are real stresses and strains. This is a 75-year-old system. It's trying to accommodate a bunch of different new things. For one, the massive expansion of the system to include a country like China with 1.2 billion people, 400 million skilled workers. Of course that's going to have an impact. It has to deal with technology, which something like driverless cars is going to put 3 million people out of work in the United States who drive cars, buses, and trucks for a living. So how do you handle those kinds of things? Those are real internal stresses. The external stress is a country like Russia, which does not really benefit as much from that international order because it's, first of all, it's an oil state. Oil states, it's important to remember, thrive on instability. The more unstable the world is, the higher the price of oil goes. And so those kinds of states that have a narrow, single, a monodimensional economy are always going to be difficult. And Putin's Russia has become a geopolitically adventurous, ambitious spoiler as well. So those are the ones that in some ways I worry more about, because the first set of challenges we can fix. There are solutions to these problems. These are the richest countries in the history of the world. If you tell me that working class people are feeling pain and are feeling a loss of status, I get it, I hear it, but I would also tell you there are solutions to it. There is money, there's creativity, there are ways to retrain people, there are ways to give people a future, and you can see this in a very simple statistic. Young people everywhere, from the United States to Britain to Canada to France to Germany, they all want this liberal international order. They all vote for the parties that enthusiastically embrace this liberal international order. They look forward to the idea of a pluralistic, open, diverse world. Older people who are not as able to adapt, of course, have their challenges, but the future, to put it bluntly, belongs to the young, not to the 65 and older.
This is a key point. So you're, in a sense, saying that let's not get carried away with ourselves right now in terms of the election of Trump, Le Pen in France, the likes of Nigel Farage. This is kind of symptomatic maybe of a peak populism that will exist for a period of time but can't necessarily undo the last 75 years.
I think that's exactly right. I think it's a real phenomenon born of real concerns and real anxieties. I think the part of it that is not I wouldn't say unreal, but that is unfortunate and unsavory is that most of these politicians look at the problem correctly and then blame foreigners for it. I don't think that in many cases foreigners are the reason for these problems. It's often technology. I certainly don't think beating up foreigners, expelling them, being particularly cruel to minorities, that's not going to solve the problem. That's not going to reindustrialize, say, the Midwest in the United States. But I think that it's important to remember, I think that these challenges will be overcome, but then there'll be new ones. I don't envision a liberal international order or an open world system with, 100 countries that are now actively participating in it where you don't have problems. Of course, you'll solve one set of problems, that'll create their own problems. That's life. What it tells you is you have to keep working at it.
Mm-hmm. Just to talk a little bit about geography, some people would say that Europe is both the exemplar and the product of the liberal international order, a continent torn apart by war, infected by something far worse than populism over 60 years ago. That Europe today is struggling. It's struggling politically, it's struggling economically. Why shouldn't people look at Europe and say, maybe that's a bellwether for where the larger liberal international order is headed if its so-called poster child is in such rough shape?
So when people say this about Europe, I always say to them one very simple thing. You should go and visit Europe. When you go to Europe, when you go to France, you go to Italy, what you will discover is one of the richest parts of the world, where you can travel almost everywhere without a passport, let alone a visa, where countries that once fought each other to the death, to the point at which they decimated the entire continent, they burned down entire villages, now live so happily and amicably together that a war between France and Germany today is unthinkable, even though they fought 3 wars between 1850 and 1950. In 2 of them, they dragged the entire world into it. This is a continent where cooperation among these countries is so endemic, is so enduring, that they really can't imagine any other form of life. Now, they face a few challenges. They face a challenge that they have an aging demography, they have lower productivity, and they've had difficulty assimilating immigrants. But let's put it against the backdrop of this remarkable prosperity and achievement. So yes, they're going through some struggles. They will continue to go through them. But by the way, when you're at $50,000 per capita GDP, you don't need to grow 4% a year. You know, they're going to grow 2% this year, which is going to be about what the United States will grow, about maybe a little bit more. And because they have fewer immigrants on a per capita basis, that's actually higher. They have less innovation in some areas, though they do very well in manufacturing. I think the picture is more mixed than people realize. They handle healthcare much better than the United States does. They've handled pensions, for the most part, much better than the United States does. You know, in some ways, Europe looks a little bit more like Canada than the United States. It doesn't have the oil to kind of soften the blows. But the challenges that a place like Europe face should not obscure the fact that the European Union remains the single most extraordinary example of political and economic cooperation in the world. Whether or not Britain is in or out, whether or not, you know, the euro was the right idea or not, I personally think it wasn't. The idea that these countries that for 500 years tore each other apart are now living in a kind of state of almost unity. I still think we should just step back and marvel at that, because, you know, at some level, isn't that the world we want? Isn't that the world that we should all aspire to? And shouldn't we be looking at that and asking, what did they get right? Rather than pointing out, yeah, they've got too many retirees. Yeah, you know, their productivity levels are not as high as they should be. Yeah, you know, those problems are temporary and temporal. The grand project of Europe remains, I think, one of the more inspiring ones in the world.
Another piece of geography I want to get your thoughts on: China. Some people would say that the liberal international order has empowered, enriched, and strengthened the world's largest autocratic state. In other words, the liberal international order has had a highly illiberal effect. What do you think of that argument?
I think that is one of the ironies of the liberal international order, is that it does empower newcomers, which are in a very different stage of historical development. So if you think about the liberal international order in the 19th century, this was an order, in a sense, created and spread and underwritten by Great Britain, to a little bit the United States as a kind of very junior partner. Who did it empower? It empowered Germany. Germany was not a particularly liberal power. It was quite nefarious state, and it took a lot to civilize Germany. It also empowered in various other ways Italy and Austria-Hungary, also not particularly liberal powers. So similarly, this liberal international order has empowered China. Now, China is not nearly as illiberal or as autocratic as Germany was. In many ways, it plays by the rules. It's becoming more liberal on the international scale. Look at their contribution to peacekeeping, their contribution in all kinds of intergovernmental areas, even their movement on climate change. But domestically, the regime remains quite autocratic, though the people, I think, are getting more open. The economy is getting more open. One would expect and one would hope that over time, China will become less autocratic and less illiberal. I don't think it'll become a democracy anytime soon, but I do think it will play by international rules more than it has. And you already see this on a number of fronts. The Chinese are becoming more and more willing to get involved in intergovernmental cooperation on, for example, Iran. They prove to be extremely cooperative. There are places in peacekeeping where even in Africa they're becoming much more cooperative than they were. And look, what's the alternative? This is 1.3 billion people. You have to try to bring them in and try to find a way to make them play by the rules. Otherwise, they'll play entirely out of the system. So this is a great bet that the Western world has made, that by integrating China, you will civilize it in some way. I still think it's the right path. I think it's a bumpy path. Then there are going to be setbacks, and there are going to be times that the Chinese, it seems as though it was a bad bet, particularly economically. But remember, 400 million Chinese peasants have moved out of poverty. That's living on $1 a day, and they've moved out of that to living on $4 or $5 a day. Just in terms of the measure of human achievement there, that was surely worth it outside of anything else.
Mm-hmm. And finally, what would you look for in terms of signs or symptoms in the future that the liberal order was strong, that it was enduring, and that we should be optimistic about its ability to remain the rules-setting system of the 21st century?
I think you've touched on many of them. I think, to my mind, whether or not China remains broadly committed to this rule-based system is important. Does it want to keep participating? You know, what the Chinese right now keep saying is, we want to be more involved in this rules-based system. We want a Chinese to be considered to be head of the World Bank or the IMF. We want the Chinese percentage of voting to be higher in the UN. In other words, what they're asking for is not the destruction of the liberal order, but their empowerment within it as the second largest economy in the world. So the more they take responsibility, the more they participate, I think at the end of the day that is going to be better, though it will change that order a little bit to reflect the realities of a more multipolar world. The second I strongly believe is this issue of young people. I think the degree to which young people continue to view this world, this open world, not just as inevitable, but actually beneficial is going to be crucial, because I think young people look at the same world that so many older people look at with suspicion and hostility, and they think, I am enriched economically, politically, culturally by living in an open, diverse, pluralistic, connected world. They look at these connections, they look at the fact that they can work, live, communicate, trade, interact with people around the world, anywhere, anytime, as one of the almost the core principles that animate their lives and that they want to affirm. All I think young people need to understand is this doesn't happen automatically, and it won't be saved, it won't be strengthened by just pressing a like button on Facebook. You have to go out there and you have to support it, and you have to fight for it, and you have to campaign for it, and you have to vote for it. And if you do all that, then this world that you have come to take for granted will persist. But if you don't, look, all human endeavor, all human civilization is fragile. You know, you scratch and you can get some very nasty stuff coming out of the woodwork. I think that as long as young people understand that message, we'll be fine.
Great, an important and a positive note to end on. Thank you for coming to Toronto. I know you've got a debate to prepare for, 7 p.m. Eastern. We're going to have you on stage live on Facebook Live. So again, great to have you here in Toronto. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Thank you.
This is the end of our pre-debate interviews, and as I just mentioned, our debate will be live tonight on Facebook Live at 7 p.m. Eastern. Tune in. It's going to be a fascinating discussion on what is the big geopolitical question of our time, the fate and future of the liberal international order. I'm Rudyard Griffiths, moderator of the Munk debates. Thanks for watching these interviews, and again, we'll see you at 7 p.m. Eastern here live on Facebook.